Hollywood, or rather Western cinema, has influenced Bollywood and other Indian film industries for decades. But what if I told you this influence is not a one-way street? What if I told you that Bollywood has shaped Hollywood in ways you might have never realized? From creating theatrical spectacles for the screen, the extensive use of music as a storytelling device, genre hybridity, and even the development of techniques like playback singing, India has influenced global cinema in more ways than one. In fact, India has developed a unique cinematic vocabulary as a result of its ancient storytelling traditions that has, without a doubt, influenced global cinema. Today, we look at how Bollywood has influenced Hollywood and why this cross-pollination is essential to the wider context of global cinema. We will also briefly discuss the different storytelling traditions that have existed in the West and India and how these traditional techniques exist in the cinema of these regions today. But before we dive in, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more industry-level insights and deep dives into the craft of cinema. Early influence: the language of spectacle. Cinema as a medium has always relied on spectacle to an extent. However, the specific structure of this spectacle varies across culture and time. In many ways, the language of spectacle adopted by each filmmaking community is closely tied with the storytelling traditions of the region. The idea that has historically played a significant role in how stories are structured is the self. The West perceived the self to be a unified entity till the late 19th century. This is why, for a long time, stories were structured in a linear manner. The best known and perhaps oldest popular articulation of this idea comes in the Poetics by Aristotle, who positioned the three unities of time, place, and action as the fulcrum of dramatic or theatrical storytelling. This only changed with the wave of modernist storytellers in the 19th century, who for the first time in Western storytelling began to perceive the self as a fragmented entity. This moment lasted into the 20th century, with some evolution in the form of storytelling resulting in the postmodernist style. India, on the other hand, had always perceived the self as a fluid entity that carries multitudes. This is why, unlike the West that centered its theatre around the unities of time, place, and action, India adopted an episodic approach to storytelling, in which time was structured in a non-linear manner far more often than it was in Western theatre. Interestingly, despite exceptions, these broad patterns of story structure continue to govern the language of the spectacle of cinema in these respective cultures. This is why, in its initial years, American cinema adopted a more realistic visual grammar with linear storytelling and a cause and effect approach, whereas Indian cinema adopted the episodic, more expressive and performative style of ancient Sanskrit playwrights of Indian classical literature, such as Kalidas and Bhas. Many Hollywood filmmakers of the 21st century have adopted the storytelling techniques embedded within the Indian theatrical tradition of episodic and performative storytelling. One of the foremost examples of this is Baz Luhrmann, whose style, at least as it appears to me, has several similarities with the Indian filmmaker Sanjay Leela Bhansali, both in terms of visual language and process. In fact, Luhrmann has been quite open about borrowing techniques and aspects of language from Bollywood, especially in Moulin Rouge. It isn't even just the use of diegetic music. The saturated color palette and heightened drama as a visual language has been prevalent for a lot longer in Indian cinema than it has in Western cinema. Non-linear structures and narrative complexity. Perhaps the most underappreciated contribution of Indian cinema to film language is the use of parallel narratives and non-linear storytelling. These are techniques that, while mainstream in Indian cinema, were considered unconventional in Western cinema for a long time. It is only recently that these techniques have become mainstream in Hollywood as well. Mani Ratnam's Nayagan from the year 1987, for example, which is considered India's response to The Godfather, employs fragmented timelines, subjective memory sequences, and socio-political subtext, all of which predate similar techniques in modern Hollywood crime dramas. Another film that came out in the same year was Anantaram by the decorated filmmaker Adoor Gopalakrishnan. This film too uses nonlinear storytelling, subjective memory sequences, parallel narratives, and even an unreliable narrator. For those of you who are new viewers and subscribers, I did a video on Adoor Gopalakrishnan's body of work and his cinematic voice earlier. The link to the video will be available in the description. If you would like to know a little more about Anantaram or any of his other work, you may find that video interesting. Indian cinema has also been particularly interested in meta-narrative storytelling, which uses the medium to comment on the process of storytelling itself. This tendency too comes from the perception of the self as containing multitudes. Since we have always believed the self as containing multitudes, we perceive our identities as not only an accumulation of experiences, but as containing the distilled knowledge of all our experiences at the same time. Therefore, the creation of meta-narratives was inherent in the process of creation and is often expressed in story structures as multiple timelines running parallelly within the story. As such, narrative reflexivity in Indian cinema foreshadowed the use of similar techniques in Western cinema, particularly Hollywood. However, when it was done in Hollywood, it was done deliberately as a way of experimenting with the medium, whereas in India, it was an almost unconscious process because it was so deeply embedded within the philosophical framework that Indian dramaturgy is embedded in, that it was inevitable that Indian cinema would inherit this technique from older forms of storytelling in India. Rang De Basanti, with its narrative structure of the past and present moving parallelly alongside each other, is an example of narrative reflexivity in Indian cinema. Playback singing. India has also contributed a very important technique to the process of making films that revolutionized the use of music in cinema. While playback singing was technically not invented in India, India certainly perfected the technique and brought it into the mainstream. It existed in its nascent form as an experimental technique in America in the early decades of the 20th century. However, it was India's widespread use of playback singing that taught the world to make music an effective tool of storytelling by making it easy to include music in films. India was responsible for making playback singing the industry standard. This technique has since been used in almost all modern Hollywood musicals, including the Oscar-nominated musical La La Land. Recently, Indian cinema has earned accolades on the international stage, with national borders being blurred and Indian talent working in Europe and North America in addition to their home country. There is no doubt that Indian cinema has influenced not just Hollywood, but almost all of Western cinema in some way or the other. This is not even counting Bollywood films like A Wednesday that have been officially remade in Hollywood. Can you find any other Indian films that have been remade in Hollywood? Write in the comment section below. And if you're passionate about movies, like this video and subscribe to my channel.